Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Hello, my name is Kelly McLoud-Schingen, and I'm here today with KMS Stories of Inclusion. We have a very special guest today, my boy, my homie, my home skillet, the
Home
very
skillet.
brilliant, the very brilliant Elmer Dixon. Are you getting a little bit of feedback on my mic?
Just a teeny bit, not much.
Okay, so I'm gonna put this down just a little bit, so hopefully you can hear me because I got it up on its highest.
Yeah, I think your volume was a little high.
Okay, excellent. So listen, I just want to welcome you, my friend, and I'm so grateful to you for making this time with us today. Everyone, I'd like for you to meet Mr. Elmer Dixon. He is someone who I have admired a great deal. Elmer is president of Executive Diversity Services, an organizational development firm in Seattle, Washington. He is the perfect example of someone who has been an activist, a civil rights activist, and a professional who has worked in corporate America, nonprofit, and educational institutions worldwide. He has over 30 years experience in designing practical, innovative solutions to organizational challenges that increase cultural competency. But what I love about him is that he is real, he is passionate about the work, and he is someone who has been, in many ways, a mentor to me and someone I've admired a long time. So join me in welcoming the brilliant Mr. Elmer Dixon.
Thank you. I'll see if I can live up to that brilliance, Kelly.
Of course you can. Of course you can. The first thing I want to say, however, is that Black don't crack, right?
Black don't crack.
Black don't crack.
My mama taught me that, and she's still teaching me that at 95.
I love it. I love every bit of that. So listen, my friend, I'm grateful that you're here. I want to maximize all of the time that we have together. So let's just jump straight into it, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, that's fine. That's great.
Okay, excellent. So Elmer, the name of this program is Stories of Inclusion. And what's important to me is to give people examples of how it is that we got involved in the work that we do as diversity and inclusion practitioners. And then what's been our journey to get to this place? How do we go into this work? What drew us into this work, etc. So tell us a little bit about your story. What's the story of Elmer Dixon?
Kelly, I'm not sure if we ever really planned to be a diversity consultant. I didn't grow up, with that as a dream. I grew up, I had a grandmother, one of my grandmothers, who insisted and drilled in my head at an early age that I was going to be a doctor. And so, all the way through high school in particular, and since I was a kid, I was planning to be this doctor. And she also told me never get married. So I was planning on being a rich Playboy doctor. So that was never really the dream. However, the path, I think, is laid out for us. We just don't necessarily see it at the time. And growing up in the civil rights movement, and I'll make one correction in terms of when you introduced me. In fact, I was on a talk show just this past week about titles that people give us. And I consider myself coming after the building blocks of the civil rights movement, and most of my comrades will do the same, that we were revolutionaries. We had no illusion that the system as it existed, even as it exists today, is going to fully serve people, because it needs to go through some sort of revolutionary change. So I consider myself a past revolutionary and current revolutionary. But that being said, growing up in the civil rights movement, and I was born in Chicago. My parents moved us to Seattle when I was 7 years old. And I think the images of the civil rights movement stood out, as we saw them. My father, in 1955, wrote a poem following the death of Emmett Till, because Emmett lived in the neighborhood that I was born in, that we were born in, that my dad grew up in.
Mhm.
and he was very moved by that. I don't remember that as a 5-year-old. Of course, I picked it up later, but seeing the images of the beatings on the Pettus Bridge, as a child at 13 years old, seeing the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the cries of the kids' mothers after they lost their babies. All of those incidents seemed like they were daily occurrences. Um, but the other side of that coin was we landed in a very diverse neighborhood. That's kind of almost an oxymoron when you think of Seattle. Seattle being up in the Northwest, in the late 1950s, 1960s. But there's Black people there. Often when I used to tell people that I'm from Seattle, they say, "Oh, no," I'd say Seattle, Washington, and they say, "Oh, outside of Washington D.C." No, because they didn't know where's Seattle. But the neighborhood we grew up in, we lived across the street. My mom still lives in the same house. We lived across the street from a park. And Madrona Park had Black kids, white kids, rich and poor. The whites were rich and poor. The Asian, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, Latino. It was just a very diverse experience growing up. My parents were also very diverse in their interaction with people and had friends across the board. I had my first matzo ball at 12 years old when we went over some Jewish friends' homes of their friends. My dad used to, of course, they used to play jazz and every kind of music. And on Saturdays, my dad would have the boys, me and my two brothers, on our hands and knees polishing the hardwood floors because and while we were doing that, he would be playing the Tales of Hoffmann and La Boheme and Madame Butterfly. These are operas that he loved, and he was singing them. And of course, that kind of entrenched in us. So we grew up with every kind of music. But the reason why we were polishing the floors is because on a Friday night, 30 of his Scandinavian friends would show up, and they would do Scandinavian dancing on our freshly shined hardwood floors, loud Scandinavian dancing. My two best friends were white. One was a second generation Russian immigrant. His mother was first generation. And so we would go over their grandmother's house on Christmas. She was straight out of Russia and eat Russian food, which I didn't like very much, I remember, but at least it was the experience. And all of that was preparing me and leading me down this path. I didn't know it, but it was leading me down that path. When I became a Panther, we were the first chapter formed outside of the state of California in 1968. I was a co-founding member of the Seattle chapter of the BPP. And what I found out very quickly was that the party was had a really a multicultural platform. Fred Hampton, who was one of our leaders that was murdered, coined the phrase Rainbow Coalition. That did not come from Jesse Jackson. And that's because we had coalitions with white students, other Black organizations, Brown Latino organizations, the Brown Berets, the Red Guard, and the American Indian Movement. We had a broad aim. We had a broad coalition. We had support groups in Denmark, Sweden, Japan. We had a chapter in London. We had a chapter in New Zealand. We had an international office in Algeria. So we had this broad, coalition across the globe. And I didn't know that was preparing me to be a diversity consultant, but it was. And I ended up actually following my years in the party. I ended up as a EEO officer at the Seattle Park Department, where, among other responsibilities, my role was to recruit women into non-traditional jobs and then to protect them when they got there. And so I ended up recommending the firing of a high-level, secure senior manager, and the superintendent fired him for the grievance that he had that he caused, that he did. And it was upheld by a Laudermill hearing, which is a legal term for inside public agencies. And it caught the eye of two women that started EDS in '87. That was in '88 when this occurred, and that would have been Donna Stringer, who was the former former director of the Office of Women's Rights, and the current at that time director of the Office of Women's Rights was a woman by the name of Linda Taylor. Those were the two women that started EDS. Along with Donna's husband, Andy Reynolds. And so I caught their attention. They approached me and pulled me in, and the rest is history. So that's a very unusual path, but that's how I got to be the consultant.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that there's some similarities in our upbringing. You know, I think that my path is not unlike that, where I grew up with an uncle who was in the BPP in Chicago, with an aunt who was a freedom rider. And so having a house that had a lot of activists, but also had, or revolutionaries, if you will, but also had a lot of entertainers that would come through, and people from all different walks of life, you know, people who were differently abled, members of the LGBTQ community. So in my experience, I had access to cultural diversity ever since I was a little girl. So there was never a fear or a threat of being around people who were different from me. And I think that too set me up to do this work.
Yeah, that's the foundation. Yeah. It is.
So tell us a little bit about, you know, how did you get involved in the Black Panther Party?
Yeah, you know, growing up in this multicultural neighborhood, and having we lived, Kelly, on the edge of the red line. We didn't know it at the time. We lived on 33rd, the red line, you know, that really kept Blacks and Asians and Latinos from moving into the upper crust white community. Was 2 blocks from our house. And on that other side of the red line were my 2 best friends, both of whom were white, and they lived across the street from one another. And so you wouldn't think that I was the candidate. You know, I had other friends. I had, you know, the group that we hung out with, there was a group of us that were white, Black, Asian, a Japanese family, the Kurose family. His dad taught us judo, and Kevin, one of the white guys, his father taught us how to box. I mean, so we had this kind of community. We weren't a gang, you know. I think of our gang comedy, you know, I think of the kids that used to that hung around with each other. And so we had this very diverse group. And so you wouldn't think that I would be the candidate as a Panther. But what happened in 1967, when I was a junior in high school, this cat by the name of Stokely Carmichael came to Seattle. Stokely was at that time, the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And I remember, you know, it was an overflow crowd at Garfield. The stadium, the auditorium was jam-packed. There was speakers outside because there were hundreds of people on the street. And I remember Stokely saying, the reason why Black people don't have their freedom, the reason why Black people don't get organized is because you hate yourself. You hate the fact that you're Black. You want to be white. You straighten your hair. You know, and he gave all of these analogies of, you know, devil's food cake is Black and angel food cake is white, how we were programmed. You know, the good cowboy wears white clothes and rides a white horse, and the bad cowboy is named Dirty Barton, wears dark Black clothes and rides a black horse. And he gave several of these analogies. And I was thinking, yeah, well, okay, that's fine. But it sunk in, you know, what he was saying to me later. And I knew that while I didn't want to be white, I wanted, you know, I'd like to have the same house that my white friends had. You know, they lived in nicer homes, right? One of them even had a maid. You know, back in the 60s, there was a TV show called Hazel. And wouldn't you know that one of the maid's name was Hazel. So how they got Hazel in their house. So I want a Hazel, right? But I began to think about it, and I was sitting up we across the street from the park. We had a tennis court, and there was a young white woman, a student, who had come from the University of Washington, who was working this summer, a couple of summers at the park. Miss, uh, I'll think of her name here in a minute because we all loved her. She taught us the finer points of tennis, and I was reflecting on what had happened one summer when we had won all of our tennis tournaments. Miss Sullivan was her name. And so we won the right to play for the city championship. And the city championship, wouldn't you know it, was being held in the Seattle Tennis Club, which was down in the really ritzy neighborhood just north of us slightly in Madison Park. Now, unbeknownst to us, but Miss Sullivan was very aware of it, was that blacks weren't allowed in the tennis club. But we had won the right to play that tournament, so she brought us in, and they had us sit in the cafeteria. And I remember we're sitting in the cafeteria. We got our little white shorts on and our little white T-shirts that say Madrona Park on it. And this guy comes in, this black guy, tall, lean black guy in his white kitchen whites, and he looks at us and he says, "What y'all doing in here? Y'all better get back in the back and get your clothes on and get to work." So he thought we were the help because and we said, "I don't know what you talking about, dude. We playing tennis." He was like, he couldn't believe it. He just kind of walked away in disbelief. And so we get out on the tennis court. We kick the other team's butt, and we win the championship, win the title, and the trophies are all laying out there. And the heads of the tennis club who were supposed to present the trophies, they all ducked out. They were going to give us our trophies on their lily white tennis court. And so Miss Sullivan said, "Fine, I'll do it." And she gave us our trophies, and we left the tennis club. And I remember reflecting on that and reflecting on other things that had happened, like to my mother, who, when she came out here with a college education, and she went to get a job that she had applied for, and she called up ahead of time when she got down there, and they took one look at her and said, "Oh, no, that job is filled." So she left. She got to a phone booth and called back, and I'm applying about the job. They think black people think or speak a certain way. And they said, "Oh yeah, come on down." And so she went back in, and they said, "What are you doing here? We just told you that job is filled." She said, "Yeah, I'm the one who just called, and you said it was still open." And so I remember little things like that. And so it began to, kind of not eat away, but kind of began to awaken my brain. It was Stokely who had woken us up. And so I became the co-chair of SNCC in Seattle. That fall, me and my buddies, we started the first high school black student union on the West Coast at Garfield High School. We had to disrupt the school in order to get the BSU approved, because the principal told us, "You don't need a separate organization. You have a boys club." This is 1968. They did change the name to men's club, but we didn't care. We said, "No, we need an organization for ourselves." And so because I was in the jazz band, the stage band, playing for pep assemblies, so I was the one that led the disruption. So when the flag was saluted and the national anthem was being played, I sat down and didn't play it and didn't salute the flag. I got kicked out of school, came back in. The band director told me, "Look, if you're going to," this is long before Colin Kaepernick, the band director said, if you're going to be in the jazz band, you have to at least play the national anthem." I said, "Fine." So I played it sitting down. Got kicked out of school again, got back in. Eventually, we disrupted enough where we called a boycott of all classes. And the administration didn't think anybody was going to do that, but a handful of black kids not go to class. But what he didn't understand, and what he underestimated, was all of those white kids, along with the black kids, the Latino kids, the Asian kids, we'd all gone to elementary school together and junior high school together. So when we called the boycott, nobody went to class. Not even most of the honor students. And so he gave in and gave us the BSU. The following spring, we were told to go to Franklin High School. We were asked to come to Franklin High School by black students there, because black kids were getting kicked out of school for fighting white kids. One sister was told when she came to school with an afro that she got kicked out of school. She was sent home and said, "You can come back when you have an appropriate hairdo." So you would have got kicked out of school, Kelly. And so they called us up and asked if we could help them. So we went over there. Myself and my brother Aaron, who was older, who was at the UW, a guy by the name of Larry Gossett, who was a county councilman for years, was also head of the BSU at UW. Went over and talked to the students. 10 minutes later, we walked across the street and took over the school, took over the principal's office and occupied it overnight. And then finally, they gave into our demands and gave them a BSU and gave them a Black Studies program. And so a week later, I was in my geometry class and the phone rang and Mr. Nairmore said, they want you in the office. I said, fine, and stepped outside of the classroom, and there were two detectives who handcuffed me and took me to jail. Took me to juvie because I wasn't 18 yet. And I was being arrested for unlawful assembly. Well, at that exact moment, my brother Larry and several other leaders, another brother Garfield, were being arrested at the same time. And within the hour, when I was in juvie, MLK was assassinated. And so I remember in juvie with all the other kids looking at the TV while the country was burning. And so when my parents picked me up, I remember the somber mood that they were in. They asked me if I was all right, and I said I'm fine. But they knew that something was happening because their two oldest sons were in jail the night MLK was assassinated. Me and Juvie, my brother, in jail, and they couldn't get him out that night. And I don't know what they would have been thinking, but I knew that they knew something was up, that their two oldest boys were in jail, sons. And so days later, after getting permission from the court, we had already been scheduled to travel to San Francisco to attend the West Coast Conference of Black Student Unions at San Francisco State University. And that Friday night, the first night we were there for the conference, wouldn't you know it, the keynote speaker was none other than Chairman Bobby Seale. And Bobby gave the most fiery speech that I'd ever heard and ever heard since. And the reason why he was so mad was because days earlier, 2 days after MLK was assassinated, the first member to join the Black Panther Party, little Bobby Hutton, was shot 30 times by Oakland police in the streets of Oakland while in police custody. Assassinated in the streets, along with who was the other person who was in that so-called shootout was Eldridge Cleaver. And so he was talking about our blood, we'll fight till our blood runs in the streets. And Kelly, you could see the line in the sand drawn in terms of the people that were scared to death and the people that were ready to die. And there was a few of us that were ready to die. And me and my brother and a couple of other people from Seattle, we made a beeline to Bobby. And we told him we wanted to start a chapter of the Black Panther Party. And so he told us to come to little Bobby's funeral the next day. And I remember, when you'd crossed that Bay Bridge before, when you crossed that Bay Bridge from San Francisco into Oakland. I don't know if you've crossed that bridge or not. I know a lot of people have. When you cross that bridge and you're into a whole different environment. And we were dropped down into West Oakland, and we saw hundreds of Black people in leather jackets and berets. And I remember thinking to myself, my God, this looks like a Black army. And Bobby had made it so that we could have seats up in the front of the church because he wanted us to see and experience and know what it was going to be like if you were going to be a member of the Black Panther Party. And we're sitting in front. I remember walking in the church, and the church was lined on the walls with brothers and sisters standing on the walls with their leather jackets and berets, bandoleros, shotgun bandoleros across their chest, and shotguns at attention. And I remember seeing that sight. And up in front was little Bobby's coffin, and it was covered and draped in a flag, a Black Panther flag. And I remember as we were listening to the ceremony and the church program, and little Bobby's mother, she wanted, Mrs. Hutton, she wanted, like Mamie Till, she wanted the coffin to be opened so that people could see what the police had done to her son. And so when it came time to file by his coffin, his casket, I remember looking in and seeing little Bobby Lane there in his leather jacket, his beret, his Free Huey button on. Huey was in jail at the time for allegedly murdering a cop and was facing the death penalty. I remember seeing him laying there, and I remember thinking to myself, he was 17 and I was 17. I remember thinking, that could be me laying there. And so it was at that point, that I became a revolutionary, and I knew that I would die for the people. And so it was a pivotal moment in my life. It was a pivotal moment in the rest of us from Seattle. It was a pivotal moment in the country, because when we left Oakland and got home, Bobby came 2 weeks later. We were in my parents' living room and dining room. I remember when they came home from work, they walked by all the 30 or 40 bodies laying everywhere and just went into the kitchen and closed the door. Bobby told us that if you're going to be a Panther, if you're going to be a revolutionary, you have to read 2 hours a day. You have to attend PE classes. You have to own 2 weapons and 1,000 rounds of ammunition, because he knew that they were coming for us. And we knew that they were coming for us. Huey's first book was titled "To Die for the People." And none of us believed that we were, I didn't believe that I would make it to see my 21st birthday. I had 2 bodyguards when I was the head of security, became the head of security. I had 2 bodyguards when I was 18 years old, 17, 18 years old, because J. Edgar Hoover named us the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States. So we were the hunted, but we quickly made them the hunted, because the very first program that we started was the Police Alert Patrol, where we would get a carload of Panthers with shotguns and 45s and law books and patrol the police, find cops in our neighborhood and get behind them and tail them to make sure that they weren't going to murder somebody in the street. And that was the very first program. We called them survival programs pending revolution. That was the very first program of the Black Panther Party. So it was a very serious thing. And that was my introduction to the party.
Listen, thank you so much. I mean, thank you for your service, first of all, because that is significant. And I just want to share a comment. Monica Duval says, "This is more than a personal story, his story. This is history. Your soul speaks." It's clear, Elmer, that this is something that means not so much to you, but that has such an impact on the work that you do and the way that you do it. So one of the things that frustrates me oftentimes when we talk
a
about,
little bit,
are you getting feedback?
Just a little bit from you, yeah.
Okay.
That's better.
Can you hear that? Okay. One of the things that I have to say about the conversation about the Black Panther Party is that oftentimes people will think of the Panther as a militant organization because of what, Hoover did and the way that he framed the narrative about who the Panthers were. So if you could dispel right now some of the myths about what the Panthers were, can you tell us, just talk a little bit about the importance of that program, what it did for the neighborhood, what it did for Blackness, and Black pride? Can you do that just a little bit for us, and explain perhaps maybe why it's so important for us to still be talking about the Panthers and their lasting impact?
Kelly, the most important thing to understand about the Black Panther Party and its members is that we were not motivated by hate. We were not motivated by, the angry Black man, the militant Black man that's angry. It didn't mean that we didn't have, some anger around the murder and the deaths that were happening in our community. But we were motivated by love. In fact, it was very clear that we had a strong love for the people, is what we used to say. We had a love for the people, and we were servants of the people, because the people were most important. The people were first and foremost. And we learned very early on, Huey taught us that power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. And so when we looked into our community, we very much knew we were trained to do what we called an analysis. And as a trainer today, when we work with our clients, we conduct an analysis. And so we analyze the conditions within our community, and we knew that while we needed to shift the dynamic, change the dynamic, that people were not prepared for revolution. And so we launched what we called survival programs pending revolution. And the reason why the very first program was the Police Alert Patrol is because brothers and sisters was dying in the streets at the hands of the police, just like they are now. And so the very first program was that Police Alert Patrol, along with a program that we organized called Community Control of Police. Sound familiar? And that Community Control of Police program, one of the clauses in that program was to return control of police back to the community, by having police community policing, by also having a citizens review board that had teeth, that had the ability to pursue prosecution of renegade cops. And also the most important part of that program was that cops that patrolled in our community needed to live there. I would dare say that if the cop that brutally murdered Tamir Rice lived in that neighborhood and knew that boy's mother and father and his aunts and uncles and his cousins, he wouldn't have been so quick to shoot him. And so we were looking at ways to make sure that the community was safe, make sure that people felt secure. The very next program that we started was the Children's Free Breakfast Program, because through our analysis, as we analyzed the community, there were hundreds, thousands of Black kids that were not getting fed before they went to school because their parents couldn't afford to feed them. And so in Seattle, we opened 5 breakfast programs that fed 2,000 kids every week. And we just didn't feed Black kids. We didn't, have a sign on the door that said Black kids only. We fed whoever came in the door. There were white kids, there were Asian kids, Latino kids, Black kids. And the welfare mothers came out of their houses who had no jobs and helped us cook the breakfast. So it was a community effort, but we were teaching the community that they had the means within their community to really survive, because we went to the grocery stores in our neighborhood. I remember we went into Safeway, and Safeway said, "No, you have to go to corporate. We don't do that." And there were 2 bookend Safeways in the neighborhood. And we said, "Well, if you don't give to the breakfast program, you don't belong here, because you should give back to the community." Point number 5 of the 10-point program said, we want an end to the robbery of the Black community by the capitalists in our community. And so you're robbing the community, you got to go. So we closed them both down. And then right around the corner from one of the Safeways was a little grocery store, a little neighborhood grocery store called Jack's Mini Mart, run by a little Jewish guy. I remember I went in and I said, "Jack, we need some food for the breakfast program." You know what Jack said? Jack said, "Elmer, how much you need?" I said, "Jack, this ain't a shakedown, man. Whatever you can give us, right?" And he began to give us food, whatever he could, to the breakfast program. And the people in the community recognized that. So he closed that store and moved up to the corner, bought the gas station, and opened up Jack's Maxi Mart. His business thrived. He put Safeway out of business. But that was because it was a community effort. The community rallied around the party. The community rallied around these companies and these organizations that helped us. Gay's Bakery, which was a popular bakery, it's called Fran's Bakery now. They send bread all over the country and over to Hawaii. And Mr. Gay, the woman who ran his little store that was connected to the bakery. This is a huge bakery. Rosa knew us when we were kids and we were buying 5-cent donuts. And so we went in there and asked her for some bread. She said, "Let me talk to Mr. Gay." Mr. Gay gave us thousands of loaves of bread that not only went to the breakfast program, but went into our free food program, because we organized a free food program or food giveaway every week, where we filled the bags with fresh vegetables, eggs, bread, sometimes meat, from people that these companies and that gave us the food to give to the community. So we opened the first food banks. We had over 30 programs. One of the programs that we launched in 1970 was the Sidney Miller Free Medical Clinic. Sidney Miller was a member of the Black Panther Party who was shot by a grocery store owner. So we named the clinic in his honor. That clinic is still running today as the Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center, serving low-income families across the board of every population, every sexual orientation, the LGBTQ plus community. It's a thriving organization today. And those are just some of the programs that we had. But those programs, were based in, came from our analysis. They embodied the spirit of the people. They embodied the spirit of the Panther. And you talk about militant. If you you look at police departments today that are militarized, see, that's militant. We were defenders of the community. We called ourselves the Vanguard. And J. Edgar Hoover, in '68, he issued an order to all of his field offices through the program that he started back in the 1920s called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program. And he ordered them to disrupt, discredit, and destroy organizations and what he called hate groups, black hate groups, and by any means. And he said, prevent the rise of a black messiah. And there's a new movie coming out, by the way. I'm eager to see it. That's called Judas and the Black Messiah. It's about Fred Hampton. And he targeted 3 cities initially in 1968. The 3 cities that he targeted, one was LA, Los Angeles, and they had already murdered in January of '69. That was the first kind of big attack, was in January of 1969. It wasn't an attack on the office. They were shot in the back on the campus at UCLA was Bunchy Carter and John Huggins. Bunchy Carter was the head of the LA chapter of the Black Panther Party. And Bunchy had been the former head of the Slossons, which was the largest gang in Southern California, 5,000 members strong. And so they got Bunchy first because Hoover was scared to death that Bunchy was going to organize those 5,000 gang members into revolutionaries. And he used his tool to murder Bunchy and John was a guy by the name of Maulama Ron Karinga. And Ron Karinga was head of an organization called United Slaves. They used to walk around with dashikis and bald heads. They were cultural nationalists. They used to treat their women very poorly, very badly. In fact, he was indicted for putting a cattle iron on one of the women in his organization. So it was members of his organization that shot Bunchy and John in the back. But he was an admitted agent for the FBI and the California conspiracy section of the California Police Department, the Los Angeles Police Department. And his reward for murdering Bunchy and John was a thing called Kwanzaa. And people think that he created it. It was created by a CIA agent. And he got this holiday, they call it, that now is all over the United States. And people think that Kwanzaa, was born out of this love for the Black community when it was built on the blood of Black Panthers who were murdered in the streets. Pisses me off every time I talk about it. But so later that year, the 3 cities that I mentioned, the 3 cities that he came after were Los Angeles, Chicago, and Seattle. And so in December of 1969, Fred Hampton's bodyguard and head of security for the Illinois State Chapter was an agent for the FBI. He was an informant. And he had drawn a diagram of Fred Hampton's apartment. Because, see, Fred was he was the Black Messiah, as was Bunchy. And had called a truce between the Black Gangster Disciples and the Blackstone Rangers in Chicago. So these big gangs now were forming a coalition because of Fred Hampton. So again, he was the target because he had organized white, black, Asian students around this idea that you are revolutionaries. He used to say, I am a revolutionary, and they repeat after him. And he coined the phrase Rainbow Coalition. And so in a pre-dawn raid on December 4th, they came to his apartment where there were 30 or so Panthers in there planning, activities. They were all asleep and there's a part of the story is that they had been drugged with Seconal. I've heard some doubts about that part of the story more recently, but they were all asleep when the police began firing through the walls. And Mark Clark, who was the head of the Peoria chapter, was killed first instantly. And then Fred, the bullets were coming through his walls, and his girlfriend at the time, Deborah, who possibly became his wife, Deborah Hampton, she recalled in court testimony that the bed was rocking like a roller coaster with so many bullets hitting the bed, and they knew what side of the bed he was sleeping on. And she was 6 months pregnant with their son, Fred Hampton Jr. Unfortunately, she was not hit in the torso, but got hit in the legs. And as they dragged her out of the bedroom, when the cops came in, she heard them ask, "Is he dead yet?" And he said, "No, he's still alive." And she heard several more rounds pumped from his weapon, and they murdered him there while he was in the bed. Let me just pull this phone off. I'm sorry. No, they stopped. Okay, good. So that was the brutal nature of how they were murdering us in our apartments, in the places that we lived. And so we had already gotten the message from Central Headquarters prior to the attack on Fred's apartment, that we needed to fortify our barracks. And we had moved out of the storefront offices because they were targets for attack. And we had in Seattle, we had a downstairs and an upstairs, a duplex that we had rented out. And the downstairs was our office, which became our clinic. In the back of the offices there. Upstairs were our barracks where we slept, and we had sandbags on the walls. We had steel and plywood sandwiches on the windows. The doors were now about a foot thick, reinforced with back shields so they couldn't be blown off their hinges. So we were prepared for them. But after they murdered Fred, I remember the night we got the call the next morning that Fred had been murdered. Days later, they went to LA to finish the job, because while they had gotten Bunchy and John, a new leader had been put in place. His name was Elmer Geronimo Pratt, another good friend of mine who was framed up for the murder of a white couple on a tennis court in Los Angeles. And he ended up spending 25 years in prison before Johnny Cochran got him out and proved that it was a setup. But days later, they went to the LA office, and with a tank, in fact, that's where SWAT was born. You talk about militant. SWAT was born. They brought a tank, and they surrounded the office, and they had a surprise waiting for them when they came to that office, because we had Vietnam vets that were part of our group, and okay, hold on.
He will be right back, everyone. We just want to make sure that we can.
I just took it off the hook.
Okay.
So when they came in, when they blew the door off with grenades or whatever, they came in. They didn't know that inside that office there was a trench dug, and they came in. They fell right on their face, and then they got up and they came down the trench, went left, came right, and right there the Panthers were there. And blew them back out of the office with their shotgun fire. They fought them off for 3 hours before one of the sisters in the office said, "We're coming out," and put out the surrender flag. Days after that, they were scheduled to come to Seattle. But down in the Seattle Police Department, there was a reporter who was a good friend of ours. And he saw the cops Talk about militant, putting on all of their gear and getting all of their stuff ready. And he said, "What you guys doing?" He said, "We're going to go get those Dixon brothers tonight." And then he got on the phone and called us and he said, "They're coming to get you tonight." So we were ready. We went on red guard, which meant that we had people outside behind our out on our perimeter. We were all in, so we had bulletproof vests, we had gas masks, we were all ready for them. We had thousands of rounds of ammunition. And but the attack never came, because when the alcohol, firearms, and tobacco agents went to the mayor to get tactical support, to get approval for tactical support from the police department, the mayor told them, "Why do you want to attack them?" And their standard answer was, "Well, they have illegal weapons." And the mayor said, "Well, my informant tells me that all of their weapons are legal. And so you're not going to have police that are going to be your tactical support." And in fact, there was a famous quote in the newspaper. He said, "There will be no bloodbath in my city." They left with their tail between their legs, the cowards that they were anyway. But we knew that after we heard that the next day, that if there was a bloodbath, that it wouldn't have been just our blood that had been spilled, because we were ready for them. And so that was how we lived our lives, is that we were under constant threat of attack, assassination. But we were not afraid. We were serving the people, and the people knew we were their servants. And so this myth about militant, it was the government who has always been militant. If you look at this history of this country, it was built on the blood of Native Americans, on the backs of slaves. Every population that came here, the Chinese to build the railroads were treated like dirt. Japanese were interned during World War II. These were citizens of the United States. Our history is filled with militancy from the federal government. So let's not get it twisted. We weren't the militant ones. We were the ones that were defiant of their militancy.
Thank you so much for making this absolutely clear to people, because I think that the stories that have been told have always supported that ideology, that there was something that was dangerous, right? So it fed into the narrative that Black men are dangerous, and women too, right? Because our Angela Davises and whatnot, weren't taking no crap either, and speaking truth to power. But it's fascinating how those who speak truth to power will always be deemed as public enemy number one, right? That the narrative will always shift.
I got to tell you, Kelly, that we had got a reputation very quickly. Mm-hmm. Women in the community knew that we were defenders of the community, and women that were being abused at home would come and tell us and ask us, please. And so we would go and make it very clear to their husband or spouse or whoever it was that was abusing them, this will stop. Mm-hmm. Now we didn't, have to beat them, but they knew that we had they knew our capability. Prostitutes would come to our office and tell us, we don't want to be on the strip anymore. And we say, you tell your pimp that it's over. Now I remember a carload of pimps came up to our office, with their little pea shooters, thinking that they were going to challenge us because we were pulling their women off of the street. And they came up and they saw the fortified office. We put up the gun flaps, and we said, yeah, they just kept rolling. And so we were always seen as defenders of the community. And women also always knew that if they were being brutalized, one sister came to us one day and she said her landlord had taken, a Black landlord, had taken the door off the hinges because she couldn't pay her rent. And so, of course, we went to the apartment, got the door from the landlord, put the door back on its hinges so that she had a door, and told the landlord not to remove it again. But see, people saw us as their protectors, but also as servants of the people. And so the people that were recipients of all of these various programs that we had knew the truth. It was the media that was telling the lies about who we were.
So would you say that the reason why the Panthers don't exist today is because it was due in large part to that narrative that was driven by the government, and also the fact that they literally killed thousands of Panthers across the country in a
Yeah.
really violent and public way that it
Yeah.
frightened some of the members of the community to leave the party?
No, it wasn't the members of the community that left the party. It was because of the narrative that helped, in, at least in the FBI's mind, justify their attacks against the party. And we didn't lose thousands of members, to death. I mean, we had probably 30 some members that were murdered, but many more that were put in long prison terms. I found out years later that the reason why I spent time in prison was because one of my bodyguards was an FBI agent. And so we still have Panthers that have been in jail for 40 years. Some, spent 40 years in solitary confinement, which is against the Geneva Convention. Alfred Woodcocks, who was out of the notorious prison in Angola, he was one of the Angola Three. Two of them made it out alive. One of them did make it out, but died shortly after he got out. But we still have Panthers that are. Mumia Jamal was framed up for a murder and was on the death row for 35 years before his sentence was commuted. And so we still have Panthers that are locked up in prisons that have been there for 40 plus years. But it was the COINTELPRO program, this counterintelligence program, that sowed dissent inside the party internally, because we didn't know who was an agent and who wasn't. And that initially helped erode the trust with inside the party, eventually to the point where the party ceased to exist. But it was the onslaught of COINTELPRO that eventually caused the party to end. We ran Bobby Seale successfully for mayor in Oakland in 1973, forced a runoff vote, and forced the first Oakland to have as a result of that, had the first Black mayor in its history. We ran Elaine Brown for city council twice. She also made dynamic changes in Oakland. That was the base of operation that we were building. So a lot of the programs that we started still exist. A lot of the efforts that we launched have been taken up by members of the community. So, the era of the Panther, the foundations that we laid are still very real today. Young people. I was just on a talk show last week with a young woman, 20 years old, who was a young revolutionary in her own right, who works with other organizers in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it looks very different today. There's not people in the street, but they've learned the lessons of the Black Panther Party. The fact that we had a 10-point program, a platform that gave us a foundation. I remember when Black Lives Matter first started, they had no platform. And I remember members of the party said to them, including myself, you need a platform, you need a program. And they organized it. And so they were more successful this time around. They forced, in Seattle, where my office is, they forced the budget of the police department to be redistributed. And there's a new law in place that limits the ability of cops to just randomly kill people in the street. And so there's been some changes that have occurred, but the legacy of the party is still very much alive. And that's the most important thing, is that the vanguard still lives on.
Thank you so much for that. Listen, there's lots of wonderful comments of support. So Monica says, challenging the narrative right here, very powerful. Yes, you can get access to this recording and share it later. And then Holly even says, when is your memoir coming out?
Well, the title is Die Standing. It's in editing right now. I'm hoping to get it out first of next year.
Excellent. We are super excited about that coming. Listen, thank you again so much, Elma. I could talk to you forever about this, but if there's one thing that you talk about, because I think that what people will say is, how was he involved in this revolutionary organization that was very much pro-Black, and then end up being somebody who is incredibly inclusive? Some people will see those as contradictory. Can you talk a little bit about how it is that it truly is
our,
if you
our,
care.
our struggle, our
Yeah.
struggle was inclusive. As I described earlier, we had a multinational, multi-ethnic, framework. But how it's transcended into my work, obviously I bring the same passion to my work. I'm here in Vegas now doing leadership training for leaders to be inclusive leaders. And so it translates perfectly in terms of the level of commitment they need, the intentionality that they have to have in order to model inclusive behavior. And so that transcends right into the classroom. And so obviously I'm not wearing a leather jacket and a beret and with a gun underneath my arm. I'm armed with the knowledge of inclusion and what it looks like, what multicultural work looks like. You do the same thing, Kelly, when you go into a room. I just happen to have that as my background. That's what still inspires me today. And I'm going to continue doing this until I can no longer do it. We work with George Simons. I work with George in Finland every year. George is 83 years old and he's still trucking, So George is like my role model, if George can do it and to his 80s and maybe his 90s, I'm going to be doing it too, because there's still a whole lot of work out there to be done. And so it translates perfectly into the classroom. I think the bigger, the enthusiasm, these leaders in these corporations, we've transformed some corporations in our work. We had some very large companies, PepsiCo International. The very first woman of color to lead a Fortune 100 company was Indra Nooyi. And Indra was in my class in Purchase, New York, when we first launched PepsiCo back in 2005, when Steve Reinemund was still president of the company, who also was a progressive leader. U.S. Gypsum, we had a 12-year relationship with them. They ended up getting an award and recognition in 1997 for the best overall D&I program and strategy from an organization called Chicago United. These are changes that they implemented with our guidance and with our help. And so we're hoping to transform companies like we were hoping to transform America. It's one company at a time, that become more inclusive. And so, that's the work. That's what we do today, and we're going to keep doing it.
Well, listen, I admire you so much, as I said before. I'm grateful to all the work that you have done. I'm grateful to your leadership within our professional organization, which is the Society for Intercultural Education, Training and Research. And we're just so thankful to you for taking the time to chat with me today, Elmer. I know that the book is coming.
It's coming.
It's coming. So there will be a more opportunity for you all to learn more about this important story, to learn more about what is the legacy of the Panther Party and how we can use that inspiration to continue to do the work that we're doing, this important work about recognizing the oneness of humanity. I want to thank you so much for being here again, Elmer, and I'm going to send you out with a video. Thank you again.
All right. Thank you. My pleasure. And